Erev Tov, welcome everyone. Tonight we are going to talk about one of the most popular items to imbibe in Jewish tradition, alcohol. Now, drinking, specifically wine, it's almost always wine, not exclusively, but almost always wine, is one of the most common ritual items that we have throughout the Torah, throughout Jewish tradition. The famous thing of having l'chaims, drinks to celebrate to life. We have it for kiddush. We have 4 cups of it at the Pesach Seder. And while there are many times we drink alcohol, usually think, fine, you can taste a little bit, but we never actually have to get drunk, as it were, except there seems to be an exception to that, which is Purim, when at least the custom is to drink till the point where one is drunk. We'll actually come back to that at some point. But for something which is so widespread in our religion, we have to face the question today. Drinking also has some serious repercussions, whether it be mentally, i.e., making people make poor decisions and hurting themselves, hurting others around them, making themselves physically sick. And we've often seen that the pushback against drinking in general often comes from religious groups, not specifically Jews, but the question is, drinking, which can lead to very destructive behavior, again, personally and towards others, why is it such a praised, used object? And is there a kind of compromise view that recognizes that drinking can be a positive thing in certain amounts? And is there also a recognition that for some people, sometimes it's never okay, and there should always be a limit on it, regardless of the custom? Meaning that if everyone says it's the law to drink tonight, but someone says, but I can't drink, a person who suffers from alcoholism or it makes them sick, do they still have to drink? And we're going to explore all of those topics, or at least touch on them. But the first place to start is I want to try and hit on both sides. Because if you said, Rabbi, what does the Torah say about drinking? The Torah says more than one thing about it. There's not one view of alcohol in the Torah. There are a few sources here. I mean, there are many more sources than I brought. There are a couple that mention when someone's going to Jerusalem during one of the holidays that they should drink alcohol there, just alcohol in general, to celebrate God. I didn't bring that one, but we're going to start here. Ken, I'll unmute you for the first source. And some of these shorter sources, I'll have people read maybe 1 or 2 of them. We'll start at this is after the 5 books of Moses, pretty early in the Torah, though, the book of Judges, Shoftim, and it's this imagined conversation between the vine, which is where grapes and i.e. wine comes from, and a particular prophecy. But go ahead with source number 1, Ken.
Okay. But the vine replied, have I stopped yielding my new wine, which gladdens God and men, that I should go and wave above the trees?
Excellent. So even though this is out of context, the line itself still recognizes, the author of this particular line recognizes that wine was something which brings gladness, both to, and this is interesting, to God and human beings. Now, does that mean that God drinks? What it probably means, because this line is super metaphorical to begin with, not to be taken literally, is that when people are happy and they're drunk and they're bringing their joy and dancing before God, that brings a kind of joy to God. Even though we say God doesn't experience joy, it's still a joyous celebration of that. And that very idea of alcohol being a source of joy is echoed again in the book of Psalms. And source number 2, go ahead, Ken.
Okay. God makes wine that cheers the hearts of men, oil that makes the face shine, and bread that sustains man's life.
And if so when they're thinking of the fundamental items in our lives that have like the symbols, the symbol of sustaining life, of food is bread. The symbol of, well, I guess something that brings us physical pleasure to our skin is oil, and it's in place of makeup. Oil had a lot of purposes in the ancient world, but the symbol of something that we could eat or drink that brings us joy is alcohol. And I'll actually let you take, well, yeah, go ahead, Ken, a question?
Yeah. I think that psalm is from Berchi Nafshi that we read on Rosh Chodesh. And I remember when I saw that ages ago, and I mentioned that to Rabbi Shmutkin, he gave me the caveat, mentioned caveat with the Vav Enosh. Enosh is not just, like an ordinary, just a person, anyone. Like you go out, like a shikar, you find on the street. But an Enosh is someone who has the capacity of a mensch to actually to work with the wine, and that it would help in that sense. So it's not something that's how would you say a free pass to go and get drunk.
So I fully agree with Rabbi Shmutkin in that alcohol used wantonly is purposeless, and we'll see that come out more later. But really, that's not what this line here is saying. It just says that it brings Yisamach levav enosh, it brings joy to the heart of men, and then the interpretation to, you know, temper it and limit it is to say, no, this is not just makes men happy, but it's clear from the usage from the previous text and just in general through all the sources, including the ones I didn't bring, and we'll see these next rabbinic ones, that wine just brings joy. And again, we'll see the rabbis limit that and recognize the dangers and how we should, you know, temper ourselves and be moderate. But again, when you just look at the text, it just says it makes getting, and now it doesn't say getting wasted, like getting super drunk. And we'll actually see that in a later source. But just as a general thing, it's very clear from many sources that wine can be and is a symbol of a source of joy for people. That's what we've seen so far. And I'll let you take one more, Ken. Okay. There's a mitzvah to bring joy on the holidays, specifically the three pilgrimage festivals. How do we bring that joy? So go ahead, Ken.
Okay. The sages taught a man is obligated to gladden his children and the members of his household on a festival, as it is stated, and you shall rejoice on your festivals. With what should one make them rejoice? With wine.
So there you see an ellipsis there. It's not, you don't give your children wine there, you give your children candies and toys and little treats and stuff like that. And this is a very like classic, you know, gender text, you know, you buy the wife jewelry and stuff like that. We'll recognize that, but put that aside for now. But the idea that meat and wine are the, you know, en simcha ela b'basar v'yain. There's no joy except with meat and wine. So this idea from the Torah is obviously echoed here in the rabbis. And again, this is not the only view, but I want to show this side first. And it's not just that it just, if you're in a normal state, it just brings you joy. It has kind of a healing factor as well. So Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and click to unmute you as well. And if you would take source number 4. So again, we're here in the early rabbinic sources and how at least these sources that we're looking at understood the capacity of wine. So go ahead, Gloria. Rav Chanin said.
Rav Chanin said, wine was created only in order to comfort mourners in their distress and to reward the wicked in this world so they will have no reward left in the world to come. Rabbi Hanin Bar Papa said, anyone in whose house wine does not flow like water is not yet included in the Torah's blessing, as it is stated, and he shall bless your bread and your water.
Thank you. There's a number of things to unpack here. And one interesting question, when it talks about wine being good for those who are deeply sad and to bring them out of their stupor, or there's this idea that, you know, wicked people, if you see someone who's truly evil driving around in a Porsche or a Jaguar, you're like, why is that evil person having success? Well, they're having success here in the 60, 70, 80 years they're alive in this world. But then when they're in the world to come with their soul, infinity, they're going to suffer. But wine is so enjoyable here that the wicked people are just getting drunk, living a great, wild, drunken life, while they'll suffer in the world to come. So is this source saying that wine is actually it's not really a good in and of itself. It's merely a tool that can help people who are suffering, or it can deaden the senses of the evil people. That's not clear. Regardless, it's still seen here as something which, at least for a mourner, can help them out of that state of mourning. So it's seen here as a useful tool. Gloria, I'll let you take one more before we go over to Leonard. And this is a really famous source of number 5, because it actually leads to a famous story about this man who goes to heaven, and he's asked a question. Actually, this it's not in this source, but there's a similar source where somebody goes to heaven and God asks him, you know, what did you do in your life? Did you enjoy everything I created? And he says, well, I didn't do this and I didn't do this. And God says, well, I put it all for you. But the context of this source is that in the Torah, there is a practice, a mitzvah called Nazirut, to become a Nazir, which is for a man or woman to, for a certain amount of time, whether it's 2 months, 6 months, 7 years, to swear off any grape products, wine, grape juice, any of that stuff, to not cut their hair. It's almost to become a quasi-priest, a quasi-Kohen. They could even serve in the temple in some capacity. And the thing is, at the end of this, they bring a sin offering. And the question is, whoa, They made an oath to God that they would be loyal to God and swear off drink and everything. What sin did they do? They actually wanted to become closer to God. So go ahead, Gloria, source number 5.
It is written with regard to the priest who sacrificed the offering of a Nazarite, and he shall make atonement for him, for that he sinned against the soul. And against which soul did the Nazarite sin? Rather, his sin is that he caused himself suffering by refraining from wine.
Excellent, thank you. So this would be a nice source against, for example, prohibition. If there's a religious prohibitionist, wine is evil, and we will come to that in just a moment. But someone could say, look, God clearly wanted us to gave us wine so that we could enjoy it. And as Ken pointed out, and I keep hinting at it because we'll come to it in the next few pages, is enjoying wine and getting totally just, schnonked out of your brain. That's not a real word, but getting very drunk. That's not the same thing. However, it's clear from all of these sources, and there is a very strong evidence in Judaism and in practice that there is a place for wine, and it has become a symbol that allows people to experience joy. But before we go on to the next section, any questions up until now? Excellent, very good. And those who joined a bit later, Lindsay, Elizabeth, welcome. Wonderful to see you. So now we're going to look at the second section. And this is very interesting because it's not, these are the sources that take a more negative view of specifically wine, but alcohol in general and getting drunk. But they're not, it's not like, the sources for it are the early Torah and then against it are the later prophets. The sources are all, relatively contemporary. You have sources in the 5 books of Moses that are for wine and against wine. You have sources in the prophets that are for and against. You have sources in the Talmud that are for and against. So obviously we're going to try and figure out what's the line that connects them, but consider that there's not one single vision of understanding of wine, but maybe we can find how they're connected. So Leonard, if you would please take from the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, this is a famous law. And actually it comes up in, we already were past, it was a few chapters ago, but it's right around the section of the death of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu. They go in to offer a strange offering to God, and then the fire consumes them and kills them. And the Torah doesn't explain what they did wrong, yet we get this voice, this source, this verse right around that, and people often connect it. What was the sin that led to the death of Nadav and Avihu? It's because they went into the holy place. Go ahead, Leonard.
Sober before God, it's called. Do not drink wine that will lead to intoxication, neither you nor your sons with you, when you go into the tent of meeting, so that you shall not die. This is an eternal statute for your generation.
Excellent. Now, this is specifically talking to priests. And in fact, today on Simchat Torah, when there's a custom for people and we're celebrating the Torah and everything, and a lot of people have little shots of whiskey, whatever it is like that, the custom has developed that Kohanim, priest, when they do the duchenin, they do the special priestly blessing, that it's actually moved earlier in the service than it usually is. Usually it's later in the Musaf, but we do it earlier. Why? Because the rabbis were concerned people were drinking, and by the time they got to their priestly duty to bless the congregation, they would be drunk. And even though this is, a Kohen in Lake Park doing the priestly blessing, Birkat Kohanim is not the same as a priest going into the temple, they still connect that practice. However, the fact here is Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aharon, went in and were killed. And then we have this verse that says, don't go into the tent of meeting, you or your sons, and get drunk. And again, that's why people connect the stories. But regardless, there's this idea that one should not come before God drunk, should not come before God when they have had too much to drink, when they're not right of mind. Now, again, this doesn't mean that nobody can drink ever. It's specifically in a holy place, but there's still, we're getting a hint at this negative association that being drunk can affect somebody's ability to connect to God and to fulfill their duties. And that leads, actually, Leonard, I'll also let you take the second source from the book of Isaiah, Yeshayahu, who describes how alcohol often affects people. And he gets it very well without being, metaphorical or anything. He gets it. Yeah, please.
But these are also muddled by wine and dazed by liquor. priest and prophet are muddled by liquor. They are confused by wine. They are dazed by liquor. They are muddled in their visions. They stumble in judgment.
Excellent. So again, here it's recognizing that drunkenness affects someone's ability to function fully, to fulfill their duties, both in the sacred sphere and just in general, one's responsibilities. If somebody's drunk, they can't do their job. And this is a sacred job. Now, again, you could say, fine, if I am the president of a country or prime minister or a priest, a rabbi, whatever it is like that, when I'm serving people, okay, I can't be drunk. There's also this general sense that we're always, certainly Jews, we're always responsible to fulfill mitzvot, et cetera. And that comes up a lot. I don't know if I brought the source here, but I'll mention it soon if it's not here, is that the rabbis really do caution people about ever getting so drunk that they can't daven, that they can't fulfill mitzvot. So we haven't seen here that wine is always forbidden, but it recognizes that ultimately all wine really does is kind of, it doesn't necessarily, it hurts you or kills you or makes you sick. They haven't said that, but it muddles your brain. And a lot of people just don't like that feeling of not being fully in control. But now we're going to get some more harsh views of wine. And just like in the Talmud above, in the earlier page, we got some very positive views of wine that like there's nothing better for man. It's a sin not to drink wine. So too in the Talmud, we're going to see some pretty aggressive ones against it. So Lindsay, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And if you would waiting for you to click. Excellent. If you would take this source from the Talmud, as we learned in a Baraita, and a Baraita just means an early 2nd, 3rd century source that the Talmud was based on. So please.
As we learned in a Baraita, you said, right? The tree from which Adam, the first man, ate, Rabbi Meir says, it was a vine as nothing brings wailing and trouble upon man even today other than wine, as it is stated with regard to Noah, and he drank from the wine and became drunk.
Excellent, thank you. As a side point, I was just reading an interesting history of the way that people have understood the Torah. And apparently there was some moment in history when non-Jews were claiming that the Jews were actually reading the text too literally, which means that they had never seen our Talmud before, where we were as figurative and allegorical as possible. Like Jews have a long tradition of not reading the Torah literally. So Rabbi Meir did not actually mean that the fruit in the Garden of Eden, of good and evil, was alcohol. This is clearly a midrashic thing. However, that's not what's important here. What's important here is Rabbi Meir says there was something that was eaten by human beings that caused the greatest downfall, like the greatest sin against God. It just destroyed, it didn't destroy humanity, but it really changed what it meant to be human. And that must have been alcohol, must have been wine. And what's interesting there is this idea that he associates wine causes the downfall of human beings. And unfortunately, again, we'll get to this more in the last sources, including this very powerful source about the ills of alcoholism and how dangerous and destructive it can be. But think about, for all the times people have a meal, they have a glass of wine and they're fine, how many families has wine destroyed? How many lives, either people losing jobs or destroying relationships, or quite literally with drunk driving, is a one glass of alcohol can really destroy the life and future of a person. And Rav Meir here is using the story of the Garden of Eden kind of as a general model for the idea that just one little taste can be so destructive. And now we're actually going to jump forward historically, and Lindsay, I'll let you take this one as well. And this is the Aruch HaShulchan, again, 19th century, from one of the best compilations of Jewish law. And he's going to talk here about Purim. And he is faced with the reality that there's a custom from the Talmud that says that one needs to get drunk, ad shelo till a person doesn't even know good from bad, et cetera, like that, just real clearly very drunk on Purim day, not at night, day. And for him, that's really troubling, because why would the Torah, why would the rabbis command us to do something that also is really destructive? So this is what he has to say about that. And then I'll unpack it and add some nuances. So please, Lindsay. Our Rabbi, the Beit Yosef, which is the name of a work written by Rav Yosef Cairo in the 16th century. Please.
In his great book, wrote in the name of the
Orchot Chaim, which is another earlier book.
A person is obligated to drink on Purim, not to drunkenness, but drunkenness is completely forbidden, and there is no greater sin than this, because it causes sexual immorality, the spilling of blood, and a number of other sins.
Excellent. So I said there was a source earlier that if someone was for prohibition, there was a source that would reject it and say, you know, you have to, drink is a gift from God. Well, here it says, well, drink is also one of the greatest. It's not evil in and of itself, but it leads people to do some of the greatest things. And as I said, there's a great deal of truth to that. In fact, alcohol in many ways can be more destructive than many drugs. But we also know that can also be very positive and used in the correct way. So what is it? And on Purim, it's actually one of the great cases because technically speaking, and I'll just say this as a side point, every time we need to ritually drink wine, not talking about drunkenness, so Kiddush, Havdalah, the 4 cups at Pesach, barring a few exceptions, exceptional rulings, everyone agrees you can use grape juice. So I use grape juice in my home, both personally because I have kids. If I have a guest who may struggle with drinking, I don't want them to feel forced to do it. Grape juice covers everybody according to Jewish law, tastes much better. I don't like the taste of alcohol. Grape juice is fine, but on Purim, what do? You're supposed to get a little drunk. But one of the most authoritative works in Jewish law and Jewish history says you can't get super duper drunk because that'll lead you to destructive behavior. So the rabbis essentially come up with this compromise, which is drink a little bit more than usual until you get maybe a little confused or a little drowsy. If anybody's like, I'm going to drink, Rabbi, how much should I drink? Drink enough till you get a little tired and maybe take a nap. But usually I don't recommend people drink on Purim. If someone says, Rabbi Dinan, do you think people should drink on Purim? I usually plead the fifth, but it's usually something I urge for many reasons people against. However, I recognize there is strong source for it, but here we see that there has to be, a balance, a compromise. One can drink, but can't drink too much, which leads to the next section, but I'll pause because we've been leading up to this. I'll pause before we get to it and ask if there are any questions up until now. And again, we've seen two sides, but again, both sides have very strong sources for what they're saying. We have examples in the Torah where drunkenness has led to death. We've also had sources like in the Purim story where drunkenness has led to the saving of the Jewish people, because Achashverosh and his drunkenness was taken advantage of, but that was to our benefit. But drink, sometimes good, sometimes bad. So what is it? How do we deal with it, etc.? Any questions? Beautiful. So Elizabeth, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And now this section, which again, the whole class in many ways was building up to, moderation. And that's really how we deal with the potential destructive reality of alcohol, but also the fact that it's an important ritual object. Many people enjoy the taste of it. Some people can drink in moderation. And we'll talk about what do you do with somebody who really can't ever drink. Either it'll physically make them ill, which is reality, or they struggle with alcoholism. And it's not that it would make them physically ill. It's that it's so important that they never drink because of the destructive behaviors it brings out. For them, there's no moderation. It's all or nothing. But for the average person, can there be a kind of compromise middle thing, recognizing that a little bit of alcohol can be okay in moderation? So Elizabeth, if you would please take this source from the Talmud. And I actually mentioned this earlier, that there's more than one kind of drunk. And that's where the discussion really starts, is having a sip or a little glass of wine is not what the real rabbis are really talking about when they talk about sins of immorality and destruction and death. So please, Elizabeth.
On the topic of drinking wine, Rabbi Bar Rav Huna said, one who has drunk wine must not pray, but if he nevertheless prayed, his prayer is a prayer. That is, he has fulfilled his obligation. On the other hand, one who is intoxicated with wine must not pray, and if he prayed, his prayer is an abomination. One of them opened the discussion and said, what are the circumstances where a person is considered one who has drunk wine, and what are the circumstances where a person is considered one who is intoxicated with wine? One who has drunk wine refers to anyone who has drunk wine, but whose mind remains clear enough that he is able to talk in the presence of a king. Well, that's very interesting. How often do we get to try that one out, huh?
Well, I'll explain the context of that verse afterwards,
Okay.
but or that line, please.
One who is intoxicated refers to anyone who is so disoriented by the wine that he is drunk that he is not able to talk in the presence of a king.
Excellent, thank you. So first they make a distinction here. There's a difference between someone who goes, and by the way, my bias, I'm a teetotaler. I don't drink at all for many reasons, but so I can't really speak to experience here. I've had a drink in my life, but I've never been drunk, maybe lightheaded once in Prague where I may have danced on a table. That's a story for another time, it's Pesach. But for somebody who has a small glass of wine, who has, who is able to control themselves, because it's not always a choice. Some people, when they drink, their body reacts to it more, their personality, their psychology that's out of their control. Someone who can just have a little glass of wine or a little beer and then just feel relaxed and fine. And talking to a king is kind of the gold standard for a lot of things. The way we dress when we're praying, dress as though we're before a king. So somebody in their bathing suit, and obviously there's different situations. What if you have to pray and you happen to be on the beach? That's a cycle. But generally, when one goes to synagogue, that doesn't mean somebody has to wear a tuxedo. But if somebody were to have a head of state, that's probably more relevant. That's when they meant a king, it's because they still had kings. We still have kings today, but kings were everywhere. Everybody had a castle. But somebody who was a head of state, if you met the head of state and you'd say, what I'm wearing right now is respectful, then that's appropriate dress. So to here, if someone said, you just had a glass of wine and they said, oh, the prime minister of this country is calling you right now to ask you a question about, your charity, can you speak to them? If the answer is, of course I can speak to them, then you're not drunk. But if you say, slurring your words, I can't even remember my name, you're too drunk both to speak to them and too drunk to pray. So presence of a king is the gold standard based on how one would present before a head of state, but it's really key for being in the presence of God. So for us, we can't imagine what it's like to be in the presence of God, but we can imagine what it's like to be before a president or a prime minister or a king or a queen, et cetera, et cetera. But again, the rabbis distinguish here between somebody who drank alcohol and someone who is drunk on alcohol. And that might be the key here. When the Torah talks about these ritual drinkings of it, generally they might mean enjoying the taste, the flavor of it, but not getting drunk. However, it's implied by gladdening the heart that there are some psychological effects there. So we're talking about a kind of spectrum here between too drunk to function, which is bad and forbidden and evil, and one's prayer isn't counted. And then there's having literally a taste of beer or wine and then spitting out, where you get the taste, but you get nothing. And there's something on that spectrum that seems to be what the rabbis are praising on one side. And there's something on the other end that the rabbis generally almost universally condemn. And we exist somewhere in the middle. And there's a few more sources here. Let's see. Yeah, Elizabeth, you can take another one. So Rambam in his Mishnah Torah, who prides himself based on earlier teachings from other cultures about finding the golden mean, this balance, this moderation. And I think that's reflected in almost all his writings in here as well. So talking about the mitzvah of eating meat and drinking wine on a festival. Go ahead, Elizabeth, when one eats.
When one eats and drinks on a festival, he should not unduly indulge in wine, merriment, and frivolity, thinking that the more anyone partakes of this, the more he observes a religious celebration. Drunkenness, jesting, and levity are not rejoicing, but madness and folly. And we are not charged to indulge in madness and folly, but in the kind of rejoicing that finds expression in the worship of the Creator of all things. As it is written, because you have not served the Lord your God with joy and with a glad heart for all your abundance, this proves that one should worship with joy, while it's impossible to serve God by jesting, frivolity, or drunkenness.
Excellent. So going back to something Ken had said earlier, he mentioned one of our local Chabad rabbis, Rabbi Shmutkin, who had mentioned the idea that when the Torah talks about levav enosh, the heart of man, and wine gladdening it, it talks about allowing someone to come closer to God. And I know that specifically Chabad in general, they study Mishnah Torah as a regular thing, every single day. And I actually went through that cycle. It was really cool to learn all of Rambam's Mishnah Torah. But it might be the source that he's hinting at, which is this idea, which is if and this is a big if alcohol can actually allow someone to be more comfortable and to feel closer to God. And let's say on Simchat Torah, we're meant to dance. They dance not with abandon, but they dance with more joy and they sing more fully. Then maybe in that case, it's appropriate. But as soon as it leads to, and we've all seen this, and perhaps some of us have experienced this, to the point where people are being inappropriate with their hands, with their words, etc., with their bodies, where it's clear that they're drunk, then they're no longer fulfilling the mitzvah. And that's very key. If alcohol helps one fulfill the mitzvah, then it's permitted in order to fulfill a mitzvah. It's not a mitzvah in and of itself. It's a tool to enhance one's worship of God. But the second it takes away from that, it is forbidden. And that's very, very important. So again, for me personally, the taste of alcohol, I don't like it. So it adds nothing. It actually takes away from my experience. For a lot of people being lightheaded, and again, those who it's not possible for them to control themselves, whether they suffer from alcoholism, a physical, whatever it is like that, then it cannot be a tool to enhance the mitzvah, and therefore it would be forbidden. And the last source in this section that we'll look at is just this recognition, again, of that moderation, which is even if one is going to drink, there's too much of a good thing. It's literally like, I'll just take this one and then we'll go to the final section. So 8 actions are difficult for the body and a soul to handle in large amounts and are beneficial in small amounts. So this is kind of that balanced view we've been looking for. And they are traveling on the road, engaging in the way of the world, having wealth, work, drinking wine, sleep, hot water, and bloodletting. So we're not going to unpack all of those because bloodletting is not okay anymore. There's nothing good about them. A lot of these are based on old medicine, but wine, so if you say, what's the Jewish view on alcohol? It's basically this source. In small amounts, it can be a tool to enhance our religious experience. For some people, it is not that. It will take away from that. And for them, they should not do it, whether it's a little bit or a lot of it. And that's very important, again, on Purim. And there are indeed opinions, like halachic opinions from rabbis that actually say it's forbidden to drink at all on Purim. Those are not mainstream, but they exist out there. But regardless, the point is not to drink for drinking's sake. It's to bring more joy. Now, if someone says, I like to have a beer and get a little bit relaxed or lightheaded, is that okay in moderation? The answer seems to be generally yes. Now, the impression here is that wine, really the rabbis only care about it in the context of mitzvot, but the Torah does talk about its ability just to bring humans joy. And as long as it's bringing positive things and not negative, it's permitted then, and in some context, even encouraged. But if there's too much of it, or it's a person who doesn't bring them joy, it's similar with meat. Somebody who's a vegetarian, meat does not bring them joy. It hurts their very soul. Therefore, to say to them, you have to eat meat, that's a rabbi who doesn't know what they're talking about and hasn't learned all of the opinions and is also missing the point. So to say, so those kids who get plastered on Purim night, A, there's no custom at all to get drunk on Purim night, and B, the goal is not to get super drunk. The goal is to celebrate before God and be more joyous before God and to open ourselves. That's the point here. And sometimes alcohol can do that for many people, but it can't do it for everybody, and there is a limit on it. So before we look on the final 2 sources, which are kind of cautionary tales, and I think important points to end on, any thoughts before I move on? Yeah, Rifki. You just have to click on your side. Yeah, go ahead, Rifki. You still have to click. I'll let you know when we can hear you. Yeah, go ahead, Rifki.
Okay, where did that source come from that someone should not, if they're drinking, they should not pray? Where was that again?
That was in the Talmud.
Oh, okay. I don't remember.
That's okay. Early rabbinic source in the Talmud. Great. All right, so Jeremy, I'm going to unmute you. And this last story I had actually stumbled upon when preparing this class, and it's very, very powerful because, again, it's a cautionary tale about the effects of someone's drinking on their family, and it's a midrash. So one thinks midrash are usually these wild tales with magic and everything like that, or interpretations of what Avraham did. But here, this is just a powerful story that very likely, in fact, from what I remember reading about, it's probably almost entirely true without exaggeration. And it's actually a story talking about a tall, this is, second, third, fourth century. It's talking about somebody who was learning the Talmud. So it's probably a little after the age of the Talmud. So Jeremy, if you would please take source number 1 from the Midrash Tanchuma. There was once. There once was. Yeah, please.
There once was a Talmudic student who was a pious man, yet whose father was an alcoholic. Many times he would fall down in the street in drunkenness, whereupon the children would come and pelt him with sticks and stones and chant after him, "Look at the drunk." His pious son was so ashamed of his father's situation that one day he approached him with a compromise. "Father," he said, "if you promise me that from now on you will not go to the taverns to get drunk, thereby discrediting our family and bringing disgrace upon yourself, then I will undertake to supply you with the best wine so that you may drink at home to your heart's desire." His father agreed to this arrangement, and so every night the pious son would arrive at his father's house with an ample supply of wine and food, and would leave the house only after tucking his intoxicated father into bed. One rainy day, the pious son was walking to shul when he came upon a drunkard lying in the street. The rain beat down upon him, and the children were hitting him with sticks and stones and throwing earth upon his face and into his mouth. He said to himself, "Let me go now and bring my father here, that he may see once and for all the disgrace and humiliation of the drunkard. Maybe then he will learn his lesson." And so he did. He led his father to the spot. "Observe," he said, "how the drunken man looks. Isn't it disgraceful?" Undeterred, the father turned to the drunkard. "Tell me, my friend, which tavern do you frequent to have attended such a blissful state of drunkenness?"
Thank you. Now, obviously that ending, it's like, oh, haha, that's so funny. Like the father missed the whole point of the story, but this is actually really powerful. And there's so much truth here. And a lot to unpack here. One of the well, I guess I'll start at the end there, is somebody who is suffering from alcoholism. It's very difficult, very challenging, and sometimes even impossible for them to recognize what they're going through. The father who literally almost literally looking himself in the mirror, seeing someone who's in that same disgraceful space is thinking, "Ooh, that's what I want right now." All he could think about is the alcohol. It's very, very difficult for somebody suffering with alcoholism to bring themselves out of it. And it's not just that the suffering they bring upon themselves, but also the suffering they bring upon their families. Alcoholism is incredibly destructive to everyone around them, and there's no easy fix to it. That's another powerful takeaway from the story. The son's initial attempt to fix the father was, I don't want to say selfish, but obviously it wasn't the best thing, is like, "Look, Dad, I'll let you drink, but don't drink outside where you'll embarrass yourself in the family. You can drink alone in the house." That's obviously not the best way to deal with this. But ultimately, at one point, the son is walking in the street and sees someone who's even lower than the father and says, "This will be a wake-up call to the father." And obviously the father wasn't ready to be woken up, as it were. And not only is it powerful that this story is so ancient and understands the psychology of alcoholism and the challenges and the damage that it does to everyone in the sphere of someone who's struggling with it. But this story is also incredibly important because oftentimes, particularly in the Orthodox world, alcoholism is, or let's say Jewish ritual and Jewish law are used as a mask to cover up alcoholism. Now, I can't give you numbers of it, and it's different in different communities, but there are many very Orthodox communities where alcohol flows quite freely. And when one pushes back on it, "No, it's for a mitzvah, we're having a kiddush, let's have another kiddush." There are these kiddush clubs at shul where a group of people, typically men, will go out in the middle of the rabbi's drash and they'll just take shots. And I've been to shuls where they don't do it in the middle of shul, they do it at the end. So it's during a kiddush luncheon. So it seems to be more appropriate, but they're just taking shots over and over again and they're calling it kiddush. No, kiddush is to sanctify, to make a day holy and special by saying a blessing over an important and joyful object, which fine, to many people taking a sip of wine or even a sip of whiskey, vodka, whatever, taking a little shot of it fine, that's good. That's an enjoyable moment for them. And it's a way to bring joy and specialness to the Shabbat day. But when they say, have another Kiddush, make another bracha, it's not about Kiddush anymore. It's about them wanting to get drunk. And that becomes a very big challenge in Judaism, because especially Purim, that's the place where this conversation often comes up. On Purim, where you can use it as an excuse, well, we're supposed to get drunk. Or the Pesach Seder, we have to drink 4 cups of wine. I was reading about a great Rav who for the first of the 4 cups would drink wine, because many rabbis say wine is really the best. But then the last 3, he would have grape juice because it was just as good. And he wanted to limit the alcohol because he wanted to be fresh of mind and sharp for the rest of the meal. So oftentimes, Jewish ritual becomes an excuse for drinking alcohol. And I think that not just Judaism, I imagine other cultures, religions find lots of excuses to drink. Now, again, I'll say on the other hand, drink is not evil. Drink can be appropriate. For many people, it tastes good. Even getting a little bit lighthearted, a little bit tipsy, that's appropriate. But it seems quite clear here that getting drunk to the point where a person can't control their actions, where they would be embarrassed to stand before a head of state, and all the more so God, that's forbidden. It's disgusting and it's forbidden. So if someone, again, goes back to the rabbi, is it okay to drink? Of course, but in moderation. And that's really the very clear takeaway from Jewish law. So if you ever go to a context where there's a rabbi trying to, bring people into Judaism and, doing outreach through alcohol, and that's a thing. That is the thing, outreach through alcohol, and just trying to get college kids or older adults, just getting them drunk and associating Judaism with all this fun drinking. Not only have they missed the point of Judaism, but it's probably forbidden, and they're actually defiling the sacredness and the ability of wine to gladden our hearts and bring us closer to God. It's not about Judaism at that point. It's about the alcohol. And we'll conclude with this final source, then I'll open it up for questions, is it's actually 16th century, a mini compilation of Jewish law, but I think he does a really good summary of everything we've kind of seen so far. And again, this speaks to both sides. Those who say, but I love drinking my beer. I love having a shot with Kiddush. Okay. And those who say alcoholism destroyed, life of myself, someone I knew, it kills people. How does Judaism find that balance? And I think hopefully this whole class helps show how it finds the balance. And we'll conclude with this source. Wine strengthens, hayayin machazik, one's body, and helps when drunk in moderation. Very key. When it's done in moderation, shiur benoni, like this middle amount, it's good. It can be okay. One who has a weak mind should be careful of wine. Now, this doesn't mean somebody who's feeble-minded, mentally challenged. It means if somebody knows that when they drink, they'll get drunk easily or lead them to make poor decisions, don't drink it. Don't drink. Don't get drunk and don't drink. It weakens them. Wine is good for adults and damages children. This is great advice. And this next line here is just so cool because this is written in the 16th century. And one should be cautious about drinking until the age of 21. So how did he have such foresight to know that the age of drinking? It's very likely that age of drinking, I might have researched this at some point, was introduced in ancient cultures, and eventually it came to America, but he was familiar with the older custom of 21. It is not fitting to drink before eating a bit, and one should not eat on an empty stomach, and while eating, one should only drink a little. So you don't just drink. Drinking is a tool that has to be used in moderation. It has to be done thoughtfully. It is not forbidden. It is something that can be enjoyed when done correctly, like anything, like candy, like delicious sweet foods, etc., like that. It's okay if one does it thoughtfully and safely, and it's beautiful. God gave us all these beautiful things in the world to use to learn correctly. But when wine and alcohol are used incorrectly, they can be some of the most damaging, hurtful things in the world. And when done correctly, they can be beautiful and lighten one's heart and bring one closer to God. But one can't just say wine is good or wine is bad. It really matters with how a person uses it and who the person is who is using it. And regardless, when anyone is drinking, they should keep one thing in mind. They should be doing it literally to improve their life. In other words, l'chaim,